It was an early morning at the Atlanta airport. The sun was still soft behind the clouds, painting a faint orange glow across the runway. Travelers moved in every direction, families with strollers, business people glued to their phones, and tired passengers clutching coffee cups as if they were holding on to life itself. Among them was an elderly woman named Mrs. Lillian Brooks. She moved slowly but with purpose, her steps careful and measured. Her small suitcase rattled quietly behind her as she made her way toward the gate for Flight 327 to Chicago. Mrs. Brooks wasn't a woman who traveled often. In fact, this was her first flight in almost 10 years. She had been looking forward to visiting her grandchildren for months. Her daughter had insisted on buying the ticket after Mrs. Brooks's 76th birthday, saying, "Mom, the kids miss you. You've got to come up and stay for a while." So here she was, nervous, excited, and doing her best to stay calm in the busy airport crowd. As she reached the gate, she smiled politely at the agent and handed over her boarding pass. "Good morning, ma'am," she said in her gentle voice. The gate agent smiled back and wished her a pleasant flight. Lillian thanked her and stepped down the narrow boarding tunnel. The cool air of the aircraft greeted her as she entered. The flight attendants were moving about quickly, helping passengers find their seats and stow their luggage. One of them, a tall woman with sharp features and a tight bun, stood by the entrance greeting people as they came aboard. "Good morning," she said mechanically to each passenger, her smile stiff and brief. When Mrs. Brooks stepped forward, dragging her carry-on behind her, she gave the flight attendant a warm smile. "Good morning, dear," she said kindly. But the woman didn't return the warmth. Instead, she looked at the small bag in Mrs. Brooks's hand and said curtly, "Ma'am, please move along. You're blocking the line." "Oh, I'm sorry," Mrs. Brooks said quickly, trying to maneuver her suitcase down the aisle. The bag was a bit heavy for her, and she struggled to lift it into the overhead bin. She reached up, her hands trembling slightly, but it was just a bit too high. She glanced around for help. The same flight attendant noticed and sighed. "Ma'am, if you can't lift it, you should have checked it in," she said flatly. Her tone carried no sympathy, just irritation. Mrs. Brooks lowered her hand and looked down, embarrassed. "I thought I could manage. I'm sorry," she murmured softly. A man seated nearby stood up immediately. "Here, let me help you with that," he said. He lifted the bag easily and placed it in the overhead compartment. "Thank you." "Sir?" Mrs. Brooks said, her eyes kind. The man smiled and sat down again, but the flight attendant only shook her head slightly and muttered, "Passengers need to follow instructions next time." Lillian took her seat by the window and tried to push the moment out of her mind. She didn't like confrontation. She had spent her life as a teacher, always calm, always patient, and she believed kindness could soften most hearts. Still, something about the woman's tone left her unsettled. As the plane filled, a younger woman sat beside her, scrolling on her phone. She smiled politely. "First time flying in a while?" she asked, noticing how carefully Mrs. Brooks buckled her seatbelt. "Yes," Mrs. Brooks admitted with a small laugh. "I used to fly when my husband was alive, but it's been many years." "I'm a little rusty," the younger woman grinned. "Don't worry, you'll be fine. It's like riding a bike, just louder." They both chuckled softly. Once everyone was seated, the crew began their safety demonstration. Mrs. Brooks listened carefully, though she had heard it before. The engines rumbled to life, and soon the plane was rolling down the runway. She closed her eyes as the aircraft lifted into the sky, whispering a short prayer under her breath. For the first 20 minutes, everything was peaceful. The passengers settled in, and the hum of the engines filled the cabin. Mrs. Brooks watched the clouds drift by her window, thinking of her daughter and the laughter of her grandkids waiting for her in Chicago. Then she reached for her seat tray. It was stuck. She tugged gently, but it wouldn't move. She hesitated, not wanting to cause trouble. Still, after a moment, she pressed the call button. The same flight attendant appeared, her expression already impatient. "Yes?" she said sharply. "Excuse me, dear," Mrs. Brooks said softly. "My tray seems to be stuck. Could you please help me open it?" The woman sighed and reached over, yanking the tray down with one quick motion. "There, it wasn't that hard," she said, her voice dripping with annoyance. Mrs. Brooks blinked, unsure what to say. "Thank you," she whispered. The attendant gave a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes and walked away. A few passengers noticed. The young woman sitting next to Mrs. Brooks frowned slightly. as if she couldn't believe what she had just seen. She didn't say anything, but she gave Mrs. Brooks a sympathetic look. About an hour into the flight, the attendants began serving drinks. Mrs. Brooks smiled as the cart approached. "Could I have a cup of tea, please?" she asked kindly. "Tea?" the attendant repeated. "You'll have to wait. I need to finish this section first." "That's fine, dear," Mrs. Brooks said quickly, "whenever you have time." But the tone had already drawn attention again. The young woman beside her glanced up, her eyebrows raised. The passengers a few rows ahead exchanged looks quietly. It wasn't what the attendant said. It was how she said it. Cold. Dismissive. Like Mrs. Brooks was an inconvenience rather than a person. When the tea finally came, Mrs. Brooks smiled again. "Thank you very much," she said sincerely. The attendant didn't reply. She simply moved on. Lillian stared out the window for a while, sipping her tea carefully. She tried not to dwell on the woman's behavior. She told herself maybe the attendant was just tired or stressed. After all, everyone had bad days. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. She remembered moments from her past, times when people had spoken to her that same way, with that same edge of disdain. Times when she had chosen to rise above it, because she believed responding with grace was the only way to keep her dignity. So she sat quietly, holding her cup steady, her reflection faint in the glass beside the clouds. The young woman next to her finally said in a low voice, "You don't deserve that kind of treatment. That was uncalled for." Mrs. Brooks smiled faintly. "It's all right, dear. Some people just forget to be kind." The young woman shook her head. "Still, it's not right. You've done nothing wrong." Mrs. Brooks nodded, her gentle eyes thoughtful. "Thank you. You're very kind to notice." The flight continued in relative quiet after that. A soft announcement came over the speakers, reminding passengers to keep their seatbelts fastened as light turbulence was expected. The lights dimmed slightly as the plane passed through a patch of clouds. Mrs. Brooks closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She thought about her family waiting for her at the airport, the hugs, the laughter, the warmth. She had raised her children to treat everyone with respect. That was something she believed in deeply. But as the plane bumped slightly and her teacup trembled on the tray, she couldn't help feeling uneasy. The attendant had passed by again, chatting politely with other passengers but barely glancing at her. It was small but noticeable. The difference in tone. The selective kindness. The young woman beside her took out her phone, pretending to scroll, but she subtly turned on the camera, just in case things got worse. She hoped she wouldn't need to use it. Meanwhile, Mrs. Brooks reached into her bag and pulled out a small paperback book, one she always carried for long trips. It was a collection of short poems she used to read to her students. She smiled softly as she opened it to a familiar page. Her late husband had given it to her decades ago. The words always brought her comfort. As the plane leveled out again, she read quietly to herself, her voice barely a whisper. Around her, the world moved on, passengers chatting, the hum of engines, the faint clink of cups from the galley. But the tension in the air hadn't gone unnoticed. The young woman sitting next to her kept glancing at the flight attendant, who seemed to grow more impatient as the flight continued. Small moments added up, tight smiles, dismissive tones, unnecessary remarks. Mrs. Brooks, ever composed, stayed calm. She wasn't one to cause trouble. She had endured far worse in her life, and she believed patience was its own kind of strength. Still, as she looked out the window at the endless stretch of clouds, she whispered quietly to herself, "Just a few more hours, then home." What she didn't know was that this quiet flight would soon become something far bigger, a moment that would remind everyone on board what true respect and decency really meant. For now, she simply sat by the window, unaware that eyes around her were beginning to notice, and that the smallest acts of cruelty can often lead to the most unexpected forms of justice. The plane had been in the air for more than an hour now. Most of the passengers were relaxed, reading or watching movies. The lights were dim and the air had that usual dry airplane smell mixed with a faint scent of coffee. Mrs. Brooks sat quietly by the window, still reading her little book. Every now and then she looked out at the clouds drifting by, soft and white like waves in the sky. The young woman beside her, who had introduced herself earlier as Jasmine, had taken out her laptop and was typing something. Every once in a while, she glanced at Mrs. Brooks to make sure she was comfortable. "Are you doing okay, ma'am?" she asked softly. Mrs. Brooks smiled. "I'm fine, dear. Just a little tired. These seats aren't made for old bones like mine." Jasmine chuckled. "That's true for all of us," she said, shifting in her seat. Just then, the sound of footsteps approached. The same flight attendant came down the aisle with the drink cart again, collecting empty cups. Her expression was as tight as before, and her tone hadn't softened either. She reached for Mrs. Brooks' empty cup without a word. "Oh, thank you," Mrs. Brooks said politely, handing it to her. The attendant didn't reply. She simply took it and moved on. Jasmine frowned. "Unbelievable," she muttered under her breath. Mrs. Brooks pretended not to hear. She didn't want to make a scene. "Let it go, dear," she whispered. "Maybe she's having a hard day." But Jasmine shook her head. "That's no excuse for being rude to people. Especially you." The words were soft, but they carried a quiet anger. Jasmine wasn't the only one noticing anymore. A man 2 rows ahead turned his head slightly, watching. A couple behind them exchanged looks. The pattern was becoming obvious. Another hour passed. The flight had reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign was off. Some passengers were sleeping, while others stretched their legs or walked toward the restroom. Mrs. Brooks decided she wanted another cup of tea. She pressed the call button again, hoping it wouldn't annoy the flight attendant. After a moment, the same woman appeared, her voice flat. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Brooks gave a small smile. "If it's not too much trouble, could I have another cup of tea?" The attendant looked at her for a moment, almost as if debating whether to say something sharp again. Then she sighed loudly. "I'll see what I can do," she said, and walked away. Jasmine's eyes followed her. "She talks to everyone else politely," she whispered. "But with you, it's like she's forcing herself not to snap." Mrs. Brooks stayed quiet. Her hands rested gently on her lap. She didn't want to believe someone could treat her that way for no reason. She had always believed that people were mostly good, that kindness could melt even the coldest attitude. When the attendant returned, she placed the cup of tea on the tray table with a bit too much force. The hot liquid trembled dangerously close to the edge. "Here," she said curtly. "Thank you very much," Mrs. Brooks said softly, even though her voice shook just a little. The woman didn't answer. She turned and walked back down the aisle, her shoes clicking sharply against the floor. The teacup rattled slightly on the tray. Mrs. Brooks steadied it carefully, her hands trembling. She took a small sip and smiled faintly to herself. The tea was too strong, but she didn't mind. She was grateful just to have it. A few minutes later, the plane hit a pocket of turbulence. It wasn't serious, but enough to jostle everyone slightly. Mrs. Brooks tried to hold her cup steady, but a few drops splashed onto her napkin. "Oh dear," she murmured quietly, dabbing at the spill with a tissue. That's when the flight attendant appeared again, walking briskly down the aisle. She saw the damp napkin and the bit of tea on the tray and frowned. "Ma'am, you need to be more careful," she said sharply. Mrs. Brooks blinked in surprise. "I'm so sorry, it just—" "This is why we ask passengers to wait until turbulence is over before handling hot drinks," the woman interrupted. "You could have burned yourself or made a mess for us to clean." The tone was harsh, and several passengers nearby turned to look. Jasmine sat up straight, her eyes narrowing. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It's not her fault." The plane shook. "It was turbulence." The attendant gave her a cold look. "I'm speaking to the passenger, not to you." "Well, maybe you should speak more respectfully," Jasmine replied. "You've been rude to her the entire flight." A quiet murmur rippled through the nearby rows. People had seen it. They had felt it too. Mrs. Brooks looked down, embarrassed by the attention. "It's all right," she whispered. "Please don't—" But Jasmine didn't stop. "No, it's not all right," she said firmly. "You don't get to talk to people like that. Especially not someone who's done nothing wrong." The flight attendant's jaw tightened. She straightened her uniform and said coldly, "If you continue to interfere, I'll have to report you to the captain." "You go ahead," Jasmine said, still calm but unflinching. "Because I've been recording since you started mistreating her." The woman froze. Her eyes darted to Jasmine's phone, where the small red recording icon glowed faintly. For the first time, she looked uncertain. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but then turned on her heel and walked quickly toward the front of the plane. A low buzz of whispers spread among the passengers. Some nodded in quiet approval. Others simply looked relieved that someone had spoken up. Mrs. Brooks sat still, her heart pounding. "I didn't want trouble," she said softly. Jasmine turned to her with a gentle smile. "You didn't cause trouble, ma'am. You just existed. Sometimes people forget their manners, but that doesn't mean you have to accept being treated that way." Mrs. Brooks took a slow breath. "You're very brave, dear," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's not about being brave," Jasmine replied. "It's about doing what's right." For a few minutes the plane was quiet again. The hum of the engines filled the silence. Mrs. Brooks looked out the window, her reflection faint in the glass. She thought about how strange it was, the way people could show either cruelty or kindness in the same space. Eventually, another flight attendant came down the aisle. This one looked older and kinder. She leaned down beside Mrs. Brooks' seat. "Ma'am, are you okay?" she asked softly. Mrs. Brooks nodded. "I'm fine, thank you." "It was just a misunderstanding." The woman smiled warmly. "I saw what happened. Don't worry, we'll take care of it." Then she turned to Jasmine. "Thank you for speaking up," she said quietly. Jasmine smiled back. "I just couldn't sit there and watch it happen." The kind attendant nodded. "That's the right thing to do." She went toward the front of the plane, and not long after there was a brief hushed conversation near the galley. The first attendant's voice could be heard, defensive and tight. The lead attendant spoke firmly but calmly. Passengers nearby exchanged glances, wondering what would happen next. Mrs. Brooks didn't want anyone to get in trouble, but deep inside a small part of her felt relief. Not because of punishment, but because someone had finally seen her. Someone had stood up for her without hesitation. The turbulence settled and the plane leveled out again. The seatbelt sign turned off and the atmosphere began to calm. Mrs. Brooks leaned back in her seat and exhaled slowly. Jasmine smiled at her reassuringly. "You're almost there," Jasmine said kindly. "You'll see your family soon." Mrs. Brooks smiled back, her eyes a little watery. "Yes, that's what I keep thinking about." The rest of the flight was quieter. The rude attendant didn't return to their section for a while. Instead, the kinder one checked on Mrs. Brooks, offering her a fresh cup of tea with a smile. "Thank you, dear," Mrs. Brooks said softly. "You're very kind." "It's no trouble at all," the woman replied. "You just sit back and relax." Mrs. Brooks nodded and sipped her tea. It tasted better this time, not because it was different, but because it had been offered with kindness. As she looked out the window, she saw the clouds beginning to thin. The land below was starting to appear again. Tiny towns, winding roads, rivers reflecting sunlight. Chicago wasn't too far now. She thought about her late husband, who used to say, "You can tell who a person really is by how they treat someone who can't do anything for them." She had always believed that was true, and today she had seen both sides of that truth in the same cabin. The young woman next to her leaned back, closing her laptop. "I hope they deal with her when we land," she said softly. Mrs. Brooks smiled gently. "I don't wish her harm. Maybe she'll learn something from this." Jasmine looked at her with admiration. "You're too kind for this world," Mrs. Brooks chuckled. "Kindness is all I have left to give, and sometimes that's enough." Outside, the sky began to clear completely. The sunlight shone brighter now, filling the cabin with a soft golden glow. The worst had passed, or so it seemed. What none of them knew was that the real moment of justice was still waiting, just ahead. The cabin was quiet again, but the calm felt thin, like a glass that could crack at any second. Mrs. Brooks sat by the window, hands folded neatly on her lap. She had just finished her tea and was staring out at the clouds, letting her mind drift. The sun had moved higher, spilling soft light across her face. Jasmine beside her glanced at the front of the plane from time to time. The rude flight attendant hadn't been back since their exchange. Instead, the older, kind attendant had stopped by twice, once to check if Mrs. Brooks was comfortable and once to refill her water. Still, there was tension in the air. You could almost feel it, like a faint hum beneath the normal buzz of travel. Mrs. Brooks looked toward the aisle and saw the same attendant returning at last. She moved quickly, carrying a tray of snacks, her lips pressed tightly together. Her face was calm, but her eyes were hard. When she reached their row, she paused. "Would you like a snack?" she asked, her tone controlled but clipped. Mrs. Brooks smiled gently. "No, thank you, dear. I'm fine." The attendant gave a small nod and moved to the next passenger without another word. Jasmine looked at Mrs. Brooks after she passed. "She's trying to act normal," she whispered, "but she's still upset." Mrs. Brooks gave a small shrug. "I suppose she is. Maybe she feels embarrassed." "Good," Jasmine said softly. "She should." Mrs. Brooks chuckled quietly. "Sometimes people need a little grace to find their better side." Jasmine smiled. "You're too patient." "I've had practice," Mrs. Brooks said, her eyes crinkling at the corners. For a few minutes, the air seemed lighter again. The plane glided smoothly through the sky, and the chatter of passengers filled the space. A baby cried softly somewhere near the back, and someone was laughing quietly at a movie. It almost felt normal again, but it didn't last. A sudden announcement came over the speaker. The lead attendant's voice was calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. We may experience a bit of turbulence shortly." A few passengers hurried back to their seats. The fasten seatbelt sign lit up. The plane began to shake lightly, then more strongly. Mrs. Brooks gripped the armrests, trying to stay calm. She had never liked turbulence. Jasmine noticed and placed her hand gently on Mrs. Brooks's arm. "It's okay," she said softly. "It's just bumps in the air." Mrs. Brooks nodded. "I know, dear. Just makes me a little nervous." After a few minutes, the shaking eased. The plane steadied and passengers started to relax again. But just as things were settling, the flight attendant from earlier appeared once more, walking briskly down the aisle. Her eyes moved quickly from row to row as if she were looking for something, or someone. When she reached Mrs. Brooks's row, she stopped again. "Ma'am," she said sharply, "I need you to check your tray. Is it locked in the upright position?" Mrs. Brooks looked down at it, confused. "Yes, I believe it is." The attendant leaned closer, tugging at the tray unnecessarily. "It wasn't secure," she said in a cold tone. Jasmine frowned. "It looked fine to me." The woman ignored her. "Ma'am, please make sure you're following all safety instructions," she said. Her words pointed. Mrs. Brooks blinked. "Of course," she said softly. "I didn't mean to do anything wrong." A few nearby passengers exchanged glances. It was happening again. The same tone, the same unnecessary attitude. Finally, Jasmine couldn't stay silent anymore. "Why are you singling her out?" she asked calmly. "You've been hovering over her the whole flight. You don't talk to anyone else this way." The attendant turned slowly, her face stiff. "Ma'am, please refrain from making accusations. I'm simply doing my job." "No," Jasmine said, keeping her voice even. "You're not. You're being unkind for no reason, and we all see it." The man seated 2 rows ahead spoke up. "She's right," he said. "We've all been watching. You've been rude to that lady since boarding." Another passenger added, "It's not okay. We all noticed it." A quiet wave of agreement spread through the cabin. Heads turned. People nodded. Some whispered softly to each other. The tension that had been simmering finally rose to the surface. The attendant's face flushed. "This is inappropriate," she said quickly. "You're disrupting the flight." "No," Jasmine replied. "You did that when you started treating a 76-year-old woman with disrespect." The voices of the passengers grew louder. The murmur became a collective sound of frustration and disbelief. At that moment, the lead flight attendant appeared from the front of the plane. Her calm but firm presence seemed to silence the cabin. She looked from Jasmine to Mrs. Brooks, then at the other passengers. "What seems to be the problem here?" Before anyone could speak, the younger attendant blurted out, "They're accusing me of something I didn't do." Jasmine took a deep breath. "No one's accusing you. We're pointing out what's happening. You've spoken harshly to this woman the entire flight, and several people have witnessed it. I even have it recorded." The lead attendant blinked. "Recorded?" Jasmine nodded and lifted her phone. "Yes, I wasn't going to use it unless things got worse, but I think you should see it." Mrs. Brooks turned to her quickly, her eyes wide. "Oh dear, please, don't cause trouble for yourself." Jasmine smiled gently. "It's okay, ma'am. You didn't do anything wrong." The lead attendant looked between them, then gestured. "Let's talk quietly," she said. "May I see the video?" Jasmine handed over her phone. The older woman watched closely for a few seconds. Her expression shifted, from neutral to concerned. Then she looked up at the younger attendant, who was standing stiffly, her eyes fixed on the floor. "I'll take care of this," the lead attendant said firmly. She thanked Jasmine and returned the phone. Then she turned to the passengers. "Everyone, thank you for your patience. Please stay seated for now." We'll resolve this matter appropriately. The younger attendant opened her mouth as if to argue, but the lead attendant quietly said, "We'll speak in the galley. Now please." The woman hesitated, then turned and walked briskly toward the front. The cabin fell silent again. The tension slowly drained from the air. Some passengers whispered softly. Others just looked relieved. Jasmine leaned back in her seat, letting out a quiet sigh. Mrs. Brooks sat still for a moment, processing what had just happened. "I never meant for all that," she said softly. "I know," Jasmine replied kindly. "You didn't do anything wrong. You've been nothing but polite." Mrs. Brooks looked down at her hands. "I just didn't want anyone to feel embarrassed." Jasmine smiled. "You're kind. But sometimes, people have to be held accountable for how they treat others." The plane continued its smooth flight toward Chicago. The older, kinder attendant returned a few minutes later, leaning down to whisper to Mrs. Brooks. "Everything's okay now," she said gently. "I'm so sorry for what you went through. It's being handled." Mrs. Brooks nodded, her eyes warm but tired. "Thank you, dear. I appreciate that," the woman smiled kindly. "If you need anything at all, just press the call button. I'll be right here." Mrs. Brooks smiled back, her heart lighter. As time passed, the passengers began to relax again. Some even chatted quietly about what had happened, agreeing that standing up for others mattered. A few gave Jasmine quiet thumbs-ups or smiles of approval. Mrs. Brooks looked out the window, watching the sunlight glitter across the clouds. She felt something she hadn't in a long time. Seen, respected, protected. Not because she had asked for it, but because a stranger had cared enough to say something. She turned to Jasmine. "You remind me of my granddaughter," she said softly. Jasmine smiled. "Is that a good thing?" Mrs. Brooks laughed softly. "The best. She's got your spirit," Jasmine smiled wider. "Then she must be amazing." They both laughed gently, and for the first time that flight, Mrs. Brooks felt truly at ease. Near the front of the plane, the lead attendant finished her conversation with the younger woman. The younger attendant looked shaken, her shoulders slumped slightly. She wasn't shouting or arguing anymore. She simply nodded and stepped aside, leaving the galley. The lead attendant made a quiet announcement over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the earlier disturbance. Please be assured that the matter has been addressed. Thank you for your understanding." Mrs. Brooks closed her eyes and took a slow breath. She didn't want anyone to lose their job, but she hoped this experience would remind that woman and everyone else of something she had spent her whole life teaching. Respect is not optional. It's a choice we make every day. As the plane began its descent toward Chicago, the light outside grew brighter. Mrs. Brooks looked down at the tiny shapes below, the rivers, the roads, the homes. Her heart filled with quiet gratitude. She whispered softly, "Thank you." Though she wasn't sure who she was thanking, Jasmine, the kind attendant, or maybe just the universe for giving her a little justice in the sky. And while she didn't know it yet, the story wasn't over. The real moment of truth was waiting just beyond the runway, where everything would come full circle. The plane began its slow descent toward Chicago. Outside the window, the sun was bright and low, casting long streaks of gold across the clouds. Mrs. Brooks leaned closer to the glass, her eyes lighting up as she saw the faint outline of the city below. She had always loved that view, the endless stretch of buildings, the sparkle of the lake, the feeling that something familiar was waiting for her. Jasmine glanced out too. "Looks like we're almost there," she said with a smile. Mrs. Brooks nodded softly. "Yes, it's been a long flight, hasn't it?" "It sure has," Jasmine replied with a small laugh. "But it's ending on a better note." Mrs. Brooks smiled but didn't say anything. She was thinking about everything that had happened. The tension, the embarrassment, and then the quiet strength that had filled the cabin when people finally spoke up. It had been an emotional journey, not just through the sky, but through human nature itself. The seatbelt sign came on again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our final descent into Chicago," the captain's voice said over the intercom. "Please return your seats and tray tables to their upright position. We'll be landing shortly." The sound of seatbelts clicking filled the air. Bags were pushed under seats, windows adjusted. The cabin had that mix of excitement and relief that always comes before landing. As the city came into view, the lead flight attendant walked slowly down the aisle, checking that everyone was ready. When she reached Mrs. Brooks's row, She stopped and leaned in kindly. "How are you feeling, ma'am?" she asked gently. Mrs. Brooks smiled. "I'm fine, thank you." "You've been very kind," the woman returned the smile. "I just want you to know we take these matters seriously. I've already reported what happened. You won't have to worry about it any further." "Oh dear," Mrs. Brooks said softly. "I didn't want to cause anyone trouble." The attendant shook her head. "You didn't. You were treated unfairly and we're making it right. That's our job." Mrs. Brooks nodded slowly, her heart touched by the woman's sincerity. The attendant turned to Jasmine next. "Thank you for stepping in earlier." "Not everyone would have done that," Jasmine smiled humbly. "It just felt like the right thing to do." The attendant gave a small nod of approval before moving on. A few minutes later, the plane touched down smoothly. The familiar rumble of the wheels against the runway filled the cabin, and a wave of relief swept through the passengers. A few even clapped softly. As the plane taxied to the gate, Mrs. Brooks clasped her hands together. "Thank the Lord," she said quietly, smiling to herself. Jasmine grinned. "You did it. One long flight, and you handled it better than anyone could have." Mrs. Brooks chuckled softly. "Maybe, but I had good company." When the seatbelt sign went off, passengers began standing up, reaching for their bags. The aisle filled quickly. The air buzzed with the usual mix of chatter and movement. Mrs. Brooks waited patiently. She never liked pushing or rushing. Jasmine stood and carefully pulled Mrs. Brooks' suitcase from the overhead bin. "Here, let me help you with this," she said. "Thank you, dear," Mrs. Brooks replied. As they waited to exit, the lead attendant came back once more. She leaned in slightly, speaking just loud enough for them to hear. "Ma'am, when you exit the plane, someone from our team will be waiting to speak with you briefly. It's just standard procedure when there's been an issue on board." Mrs. Brooks looked surprised. "Oh my." "Don't worry," the attendant said reassuringly. "It's all good. They just want to make sure you're okay." Mrs. Brooks nodded. "All right, dear. Thank you for letting me know." When it was finally their turn to leave, Jasmine helped Mrs. Brooks down the narrow aisle. As they reached the front, the kind attendant smiled warmly and said, "Have a safe trip, ma'am." "Thank you." "Sweetheart," Mrs. Brooks said gently, but beside her, the other flight attendant, the one who had caused all the trouble, stood stiffly near the exit. Her expression was blank, but there was tension in her shoulders. She didn't look at Mrs. Brooks directly. When Mrs. Brooks passed her, she murmured a quiet, "Take care." But the woman didn't respond. Jasmine noticed but said nothing. She simply guided Mrs. Brooks off the plane. At the end of the jet bridge stood two airline staff members, a middle-aged man in a Navy uniform and a woman holding a tablet. They both smiled warmly. "Mrs. Brooks?" the man asked kindly. "Yes, that's me," she said softly. "I'm so sorry for the experience you had on the flight," he said sincerely. "We've already been informed by the lead attendant. We'd like to take a few minutes to speak with you and make sure everything is handled properly." Mrs. Brooks looked a little nervous. "Oh, I see. I don't want to make any trouble," the woman smiled gently. "You're not making trouble at all, ma'am. You were treated unfairly, and it's our responsibility to make things right." Jasmine stayed beside her. "She didn't ask for any of this," she said quietly. "She was just trying to fly peacefully." The man nodded. "We understand, and we appreciate that you stepped in to help." He gestured to a nearby seating area. "Please, let's sit for just a moment." They walked over and sat down. Mrs. Brooks held her purse tightly in her lap. The woman with the tablet spoke softly, asking about the incident, what happened, what was said, how Mrs. Brooks felt. Mrs. Brooks answered carefully. "She was just very short with me. I asked for help with my tray and some tea, but she seemed angry. I don't know why." "I didn't mean to upset anyone," Jasmine added quietly. "It wasn't just her tone. It was how she acted. She ignored her, spoke down to her, and embarrassed her in front of others." The airline staff listened carefully. The man nodded slowly. "I understand. We take this very seriously. I can assure you this kind of behavior is not acceptable here." He glanced toward the gate where the flight attendants were exiting one by one. The younger woman, the rude one, was among them. She looked uneasy, her head down, clearly aware that the situation had reached the ground crew. "Will she be in trouble?" Mrs. Brooks asked softly. The man hesitated, then said kindly, "There will be a review, but right now our focus is on making sure you're okay. Would you like to file a formal report?" Or would you prefer that we handle it internally? Mrs. Brooks thought for a moment. I don't want to ruin anyone's career, she said quietly. But I do think she needs to learn that how we treat others matters. That's fair, the man said with respect in his voice. We'll handle it professionally. He handed her a small envelope. Inside was a letter of apology from the airline and a voucher for future flights. This is just a small gesture, he said. We also plan to send a written apology once the internal review is complete. Mrs. Brooks smiled softly. That's very kind of you. Thank you. As they stood to leave, Jasmine turned to the man. I hope your team understands that what people saw today really mattered. There were passengers watching who felt inspired. You don't see that kind of unity often? The man smiled faintly. You're right. Sometimes it takes one person to remind everyone else what's right. Outside the gate, the terminal was busy as usual. People hurried past with rolling bags. Announcements echoed through the speakers and the smell of coffee lingered in the air. But for Mrs. Brooks, everything felt lighter. She looked at Jasmine and smiled warmly. You've been such a blessing, dear. I don't know how I would have managed without you. Jasmine grinned. You would have been fine. You've got more grace than anyone I've ever met. Mrs. Brooks laughed softly. Grace only works when people like you remind the world it still matters. They walked together toward the baggage claim. Every step felt easier now. The weight of humiliation and hurt that had sat in Mrs. Brooks' chest earlier had lifted, replaced by quiet strength and gratitude. As they reached the escalator, Mrs. Brooks looked around the terminal with wide eyes. You know, she said gently, I almost didn't take this trip. I was nervous about flying again. But maybe I was meant to be on that plane. Maybe today was about more than just getting to Chicago. Jasmine smiled knowingly. Maybe it was. Sometimes life puts us in the right place at the right time for someone else or for ourselves. Mrs. Brooks nodded. Maybe for both. When they reached the baggage area, Mrs. Brooks spotted her daughter waiting with open arms. Her daughter rushed forward, wrapping her in a long, tight hug. Mom, I missed you so much, she said, her voice full of emotion. Mrs. Brooks smiled, her eyes shining. I missed you too, sweetheart. Jasmine stepped back, smiling at the reunion. Her daughter turned to her. Thank you for helping my mom, she said gratefully. Jasmine shook her head. It was my honor. As Mrs. Brooks hugged her again before leaving, she whispered softly, You've got a good heart, dear. Don't ever lose that. Jasmine smiled, blinking back a tear. Neither should you, ma'am. Mrs. Brooks laughed gently. At my age, that's all I've got left, and it's enough. They said goodbye, and Mrs. Brooks walked away with her daughter, her steps slow but full of peace. Jasmine watched for a moment before turning toward the exit, feeling something deep inside. Hope, maybe, or faith in humanity again. Meanwhile, near the gate, the flight attendants were being debriefed. The rude one stood quietly as the lead attendant spoke with her. There was no shouting, no harsh words, just accountability. Sometimes justice isn't loud. Sometimes it's just the quiet truth catching up. And as Mrs. Brooks disappeared into the crowd, her gentle grace left a ripple that would last far beyond that flight. The morning sun poured softly through the kitchen window, casting a warm glow on the table where Mrs. Brooks sat sipping her tea. The steam curled gently upward as she looked through the newspaper spread in front of her. She wasn't much of a news person, but today was different. Her granddaughter had called earlier saying, Grandma, you're on the internet. At first, Mrs. Brooks laughed. Oh, child, what are you talking about? But when she looked online, there it was, a video of her flight. Not the whole thing, of course, but enough to show the moment the passengers stood up, the kindness in people's voices, and the truth of what had happened. The clip had spread quickly, shared by thousands of strangers who couldn't stop talking about the courage it took for a young woman to stand up and for an elderly lady to stay calm in the face of disrespect. The comments were full of support. People wrote things like, "No one deserves to be treated that way," and "Her grace under pressure is inspiring." Mrs. Brooks sat there quietly, reading for a long time. She felt a strange mix of emotions, sadness that such a thing had even happened, but also deep gratitude that people still cared. Her daughter walked in carrying a plate of toast. "Mom, that video's everywhere," she said with a smile. "People are talking about it all over the country." Mrs. Brooks chuckled softly. "Imagine that. Me at my age going viral. Whatever that means," her daughter laughed. "It means people see you for who you are. Kind, patient, and strong. Mrs. Brooks smiled, her eyes warm. That's nice to hear. But I didn't do anything special. I just didn't want to cause a scene. That's exactly why people love you, her daughter said gently. You showed that strength doesn't have to be loud. Mrs. Brooks sipped her tea again and looked out the window. The trees outside were bright with autumn colors, gold, orange, and red. It reminded her that change could be beautiful when handled with grace. Across town, Jasmine was sitting at her small kitchen table, too, scrolling through her phone. Her video had reached millions of views overnight. News outlets were calling it the flight that restored faith in humanity. She hadn't expected that. When she recorded it, she wasn't thinking about the internet or fame. She just couldn't stand by and watch someone be mistreated. Her phone buzzed again. It was a message from the airline. Dear Ms. Taylor, it read, we appreciate your courage in speaking up. The incident you recorded has led us to take immediate action. The crew member involved has been dismissed following an internal review, and we are implementing new training for all flight attendants to ensure respect and equality for every passenger. Jasmine read it twice. She wasn't sure how to feel. Relieved, maybe, but also thoughtful. Firing someone wasn't something she wanted. She just wanted people to learn from it. She replied with a short message. Thank you for doing the right thing. I hope this helps your company grow in kindness. Then she closed her phone and leaned back in her chair, taking a deep breath. Sometimes doing the right thing didn't feel heroic. It just felt necessary. Later that week, Mrs. Brooks received a letter in the mail from the airline. It was neatly printed and signed by the company's CEO. It read, Dear Mrs. Brooks, on behalf of everyone at our airline, I want to extend my sincerest apologies for the disrespect you experienced during your recent flight. The behavior you endured was unacceptable and does not reflect our values. We have taken corrective action and implemented new training for all our staff. Your grace and patience have reminded us all what true dignity looks like. Thank you for handling the situation with kindness and strength. Inside the envelope, there was also a certificate granting her lifetime travel benefits, free flights anywhere she wanted to go. Mrs. Brooks shook her head and smiled. Goodness, I don't even know where I'd go. Her daughter grinned. Anywhere you want, Mom, you earned it. Mrs. Brooks thought for a moment. Maybe somewhere peaceful, somewhere with sunshine. A week later, a small news crew visited her home. They had asked politely if she would be willing to share her side of the story. At first, she hesitated. She wasn't someone who liked attention, but eventually, she agreed. The reporter sat across from her in the living room, microphone clipped to his shirt, camera softly humming. Mrs. Brooks, he began, the world has seen the video from that flight. You've been praised for your calm and kindness. How did you stay so composed during such a stressful moment? Mrs. Brooks smiled gently. I suppose after 76 years you learn a thing or two about patience. I taught children for most of my life. When you've dealt with 31st graders on a rainy day, you learn not to raise your voice. The reporter laughed softly. That's a wonderful way to put it. Do you have any message for the people who've watched your story? She nodded thoughtfully. Yes, I'd just like to remind people that kindness isn't hard. We all have bad days, but how we treat others shows who we really are. The world doesn't need more noise, it needs more grace. Her words were simple, but they touched everyone who heard them. The interview went viral just like the video. Comments poured in again, calling her a national treasure, and the grandmother everyone wishes they had. Meanwhile, the airline released a public statement online. They confirmed the termination of the employee and detailed their new inclusivity and customer respect program. The statement ended with a line inspired by Mrs. Brooks' own words. The world doesn't need more noise, it needs more grace. That line spread across social media. People made posts, t-shirts, and even short videos quoting her. It was strange for Mrs. Brooks to see her words everywhere, but it made her heart full knowing they were used to promote kindness. One evening, as she sat watching the sunset from her porch, her phone buzzed again. It was a video call from Jasmine. Hey there, Mrs. Brooks, Jasmine said cheerfully. Guess what? I got accepted into my internship early. Oh, that's wonderful, Mrs. Brooks said with genuine joy. You deserve that, dear. You've got a brave heart. Thank you, Jasmine replied. I just wanted to tell you that meeting you changed me. That day on the plane, it reminded me that standing up for what's right isn't about being loud. It's about caring enough to act. Mrs. Brooks smiled warmly. That's true, dear, and I'm proud of you for caring. They talked for a while about family, travel, and little things, By the time they hung up, the sky had turned a soft purple. As the days passed, life slowly returned to normal. Mrs. Brooks spent her mornings in the garden, her afternoons reading, and her evenings talking to her grandchildren, but every once in a while someone would recognize her in the grocery store or at the post office. "Are you that lady from the flight?" They'd ask kindly. She'd smile and say, "Yes, dear." That was me, and every time, the person would thank her for her patience, for her grace, for reminding people what decency looked like. Months later, the airline invited her to speak at a small employee training event. She almost declined, but her daughter convinced her to go. When she walked into the room, she was greeted with applause. Dozens of flight attendants, new and experienced, stood to welcome her. The atmosphere was warm and respectful. She spoke softly, without notes, just from the heart. "I know working with the public isn't easy," she said. "You meet all kinds of people, some tired, some upset, some scared. But every one of them has a story. You might be the only person who smiles at them that day. That matters. A small act of kindness can turn a bad moment into a good memory." When she finished, the room was silent for a second, and then the applause came again, this time louder, full of genuine respect. Some people even had tears in their eyes. As she left the event, the airline's new training director shook her hand and said, "You've changed the culture here. Your story did that." Mrs. Brooks smiled humbly. "I didn't change anything. People just needed a reminder." The goodness was already there. That evening, as she rode home, the city lights sparkled outside the window. She thought about how strange life could be, how something painful could grow into something beautiful. The rude flight attendant's name was never mentioned again in public. Mrs. Brooks had never wished her harm. In her heart, she hoped the woman had learned from the experience just as everyone else had. When she got home, she made a cup of tea and sat quietly in her favorite chair. The house was peaceful. She looked out at the stars and whispered, "Thank you, not to anyone in particular, but to life itself, for reminding her that even in moments of hurt, goodness can still win." The story of that flight slowly faded from the headlines, but the lesson it carried stayed alive in the hearts of those who heard it. People remembered the calm voice, the gentle smile, and the message that echoed long after the plane had landed. Treat others with dignity. You never know when your kindness might become someone's strength. And somewhere in Chicago, under the same wide sky she had flown through that day, Mrs. Brooks rested easy, her heart light and full of peace, proof that grace, once given, never truly ends.